Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to share with you my thoughts on the Omega Protocol Ultimate. I'm done with that fight, and oh boy, do I have a lot to say. Now, I'm doing this shorter overall thoughts video. It's still probably going to be 30 to 40 minutes, but I also released a 2+ hour breakdown of every phase and mechanics, how we went about solving it, etc., etc. So if you're looking for even more reason to suffer in the same heck that I did, then there's plenty of Omega Protocol style content, not to mention some clips of some really weird stuff that happened in the middle of Prague. But this video, I'm just going to be sharing my emotions on everything and not worrying too much about the individual mechanics unless I feel like it's something I want to comment on. So first, I actually want to talk about the boss itself. Now, we were wondering before Omega Protocol came out what bosses would show up. Oh, they gotta use Exdeath, Neo Exdeath, Kefka, God Kefka, Chaos, Midgard-Stormer, all these bosses, the Tournament of Power leading up to the final encounter against Omega. And we got none of that. Well, Yoshi P did say it's all Omega, and he meant it. Every boss, every phase from start to finish is Omega. Now, some definitely found it disappointing that we skipped a lot of these iconic Final Fantasy bosses and kind of just went to the end of the story where Omega's trying to test the data that he's earned from the Tournament of Power and trying to evolve and figure out what makes us as the Warrior of Light so strong. But I think that focusing the encounter on the climax of Omega's raid tier gives the fight a sense of continuity that rapidly accelerates as you dispose of his various forms. It's still like all other ultimates, a bunch of different fights all thrown together, 011, 012 phase 1, 012 phase 2, plus all the stuff that happens later with a big bonus phase at the end. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like an honest and true showdown against Omega, amplified to the nth degree. And in my opinion, that is a huge positive that is nothing like the other ultimates we've had before. Now, mechanically, there also aren't too many missing elements. You know, it wasn't just the bosses people were looking at, but the individual attacks that were actually used. There are definitely some things. The limit cut from MNF isn't there, plus a few other small things. The giant fists and the actual level checker appearing, those are absent from 011, along with things like the long death tether during the level checker phase. But those aren't things that are like super iconic. Those are just mechanics that kind of made sense to predict and expect. And when they weren't there, it didn't feel like they were missing. It just felt like they weren't there, which is great because you don't want any major iconic mechanic missing. And I think, in my opinion, they managed to avoid that problem with what they decided to include. Now, the next topic I want to touch on is one that's very tangential to my Dragon Song Reprise video from a couple weeks ago. In that video, I talk about how I do think it's the pinnacle of ultimate design and that it had some of the most engaging and difficult mechanics, but I also criticize certain elements of it, and I want to touch upon those same elements here to talk about how it turned out with Omega. Because, you know, while this fight is just against one technical entity, even if it's a bunch of individual bosses, they did not skimp on the length. Including phase transitions and downtime, my first clear clocked in at 19 minutes and 1 second. This is now the longest ultimate encounter I've done. In fact, if not for the recent Criterion Savage being roughly 24 minutes for a single pull, it'd be the longest encounter I've done in this game, period. Now, one of my criticisms of Dragon Song Reprise was how long it was, though that was combined with other elements that made it really feel as long as it actually was. It was a collection of encounters that they fit thematically, but they also felt so disconnected, and it really made it drag on. Omega here proves that length doesn't necessarily have to mean that a fight feels long, because these 19 minutes absolutely flew by. This is helped by the incredible pace of every phase. Every boss and every mechanic is just go, 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 with very few valleys of downtime to make you complacent. Your strategies and your cooldowns used in every phase more heavily impact future phases. Damage and healing requirements are higher than they've ever been for an ultimate and require constant attention and planning, and it just creates this exhilarating rush all the way through, even during the calmer parts. It's crazy to think that by the time there was a mechanic I was stuck on for like 2 or 3 days that was about 12 minutes into the fight, and it did not feel like 12 minutes in. It felt like it had been like maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Like, that's how fast the fight feels. And maybe that's just me, but I couldn't believe that I was that long into the fight. I had to double check because I was so shocked. Another thing I criticize about Dragonsong Reprise is how it has very little transferable knowledge. Every fight being an individual fight and not really leaning into the next one or informing the next one, I thought was a big downside. And it's really a problem that's only present in Dragonsong Reprise. So I had high hopes that with this one being Omega and the theme of it, that they would do this particular element better. And they do and they don't. They do have several phases at the start where the only real knowledge you have of those phases that's useful is knowledge from the original 011 and 012. And that's fine, that's fairly standard, but they do make sure to have a very long, roughly 4.5 to 5 minute phase where all the things you use in phases 1, 2, and 3 are amplified and used all at the same time. Not to mention, they even use some mechanics that aren't in phase 1, 2, and 3, but are from the original encounters in 011 and 012. So again, there's this great feeling of reward for remembering things, for understanding things from the earlier phase, and for doing your research and doing the old, Omega 11 and 12 encounters. And that's the kind of feeling that was missing from Dragonsong Reprise, because they just started throwing just tons of AoEs and things that, again, just felt really disconnected, even if they were still thematic to the actual encounter. It's also very in line with Omega's lore. I mean, he's a robot that's always looking to obtain data, adapt, and evolve. And that's exactly what he asks the player to do while doing it himself. It's very, very impressive how the thematic ties just work so well with this encounter, despite it being a, as they put it, less story-driven ultimate, which I'm not going to lie, by the time I got to the end of it, it doesn't feel less story-oriented. It just feels more focused, I suppose. Now, like I said, I did do a 2-hour breakdown video of every phase, but I do want to provide my thoughts on the individual phases without going too in-depth into the individual mechanics. So let's do that here, and then I'll do one sign-off, and we'll probably have about a 35-40 minute video by the end of it all. So phase 1, I honestly thought this was a door boss at first, from the use of the Final Fantasy V interdimensional rift theme, which I have to say I appreciate in hindsight, because in Dragonsong Reprise and in other ultimates, they send you back to a theme and it's torture to hear. Here, it's just this kind of like ambient noise in the back that doesn't drive me insane. It's not like every time I got back to Thornton in Dragonsong Reprise where I had to hear, and it was just the first thing I heard. And it was like, it's like, please stop talking. I'm so mad that we just died right there. So, sidetrack, I really appreciate the interdimensional rift theme in hindsight. But it's not just that. It's not just the unepic phase 1 music that made me think it was a door boss. It's a super short phase. The mechanics are so easy to understand and very free form. Like, we had the first mechanic figured out conceptually in like a pull or two. I guess that's not that abnormal nowadays, but in an ultimate, it just kind of wasn't what I was expecting, I suppose. But after we passed it the first time, when I learned it wasn't, it kind of started to make more sense. On a conceptual level, at least, because they really go out of their way to kind of train the player in this first phase for what will be the pace of the entire fight. They give you this very simple mechanic. The whole phase is 2 very simple mechanics. You're clearly marked, which was a surprise because we have the ability to see all of our debuffs and their timers now, and yet they still went out of their way to give us clear 1, 2, 3, and 4 markers to help us designate the time remaining on certain debuffs. So big points for that, despite the fact they really didn't need to. But it's the elements that you need to, the way you need to use these elements that makes the phase a little more complicated, because while it's very clearly communicated to you what you need to do, the assignments are random. The placements of mechanics are semi-random. There's adjustments that need to be made. It's not like you just go in and do the exact same thing every time. It's the opposite. You go in and do the same mechanic every time, but the way you need to move and who you need to kind of assign priorities with or understand your partner, all of that is different every single time. So it requires a more in-depth knowledge of the actual encounter and of the actual mechanic than just going where you were told to go. That doesn't really work for the way this first phase is designed for both of the major mechanics. And I really like that. It makes it engaging, even if frustrating when you wipe on it 5, 6, 7, 10 times in a row and you just want to get back to your prog point, which is a little bit later. Either way, I think it's an impressive first phase in hindsight, even if it's not all that difficult in terms of figuring it out. And you know what? Phase 2 is kind of similar, but in a very different way. You know, there's all sorts of new debuffs and different mechanics from Phase 1, but there's a very interesting skill set that it asks you to optimize on, and that's 2-target cleave. Now, 2-target cleave optimization is not anything new from the previous ultimates. The idea of damaging 2 targets, ideally at the same time, has been around since the Unending Coil and long precedes the ultimate difficulty as a whole. However, the thematic use of the firewall debuff, which only allows 4 players to attack each, either M or F at a time, makes it so that when the firewall is not up, you have basically 4 or 5 seconds to optimize your global cooldowns and off global cooldowns to get as much bonus damage as possible, which really helps you stay ahead of the pace of the fight and the pace of this phase individually. You have those 4 or 5 seconds at the start of the phase, which means that the way that you end phase 1 is super important so people can prepare for this very quick burst/cleave phase at the start of phase 2. But then you also get another opportunity near the middle point of the phase to cleave again for about 4 or 5 seconds, and you want to optimize on that as well. It's a really tiny thing, but it's very different than what we've been asked to do with 2-target cleave in the past with ultimates, and I really appreciate the finer details. Not to mention the firewall debuff means that depending on your composition, you can even just completely alter your DPS plan, and it's not going to be the same for every group. Great example is that you could set it up so that you have 1 tank and 3 DPS all attacking one of the targets and then the rest of your party attacking the other. This is really useful when you have things like Mug or Change Stratagem, which are debuffs that you want to utilize on the highest DPS players possible, even though only 4 players can actually be placed on one. The Scholar can change Stratagem, the one they're not going to be attacking, so that the 3 DPS and the tank can use their cooldowns effectively on that one. Same with Ninja's Mug, which you would obviously want to stack on the same one. Because both the bosses effectively share a health bar for terms of simplicity for the phase, this is just a great way of optimizing on the conditions that are laid forth, and I'm really glad to see that even just the slightest bits of creativity, depending on your comp, can really come out with your party expression. Now, the mechanics themselves are also good fun. There's tethers and debuffs that require certain distances, and there's, going to be more adaptability. You have all these different potential partners for the tethers, much like you had all the different potential partners for the mechanics in Phase 1. But at the same time, this phase might be frustrating to some as they're learning it. It might even be a little confusing, but I don't think it's really any harder than the first phase either. It's very consistent difficulty-wise, even though the mechanics are almost completely different. There's even some really weird difficulty inconsistencies with this phase. There's spread flare markers that you'd expect to be massively lethal if you stack them. And that's actually the go-to strat. You just spam a bunch of mitigation and stack all these flares and a stack damage AoE that hits the other few nearest people, and you just mitigate it and stack it all together. That is not a very ultimate style way of doing things. You'd expect it to be really strict. Oh, one person takes a hit and moves out, and then the other few people move in, and then the 3 flares have to be out of that, and you have to make sure the mitigation and the shielding is on point, and then come together again before the next hit goes off. You don't have to do any of that. I mean, that's what we did because it was logically what made sense, so it's the first thing we did, and we just kind of stuck with it. But it's very not ultimate difficulty, even if the actual mechanical dance is. But it doesn't really take away from the encounter either. It's kind of a relief that you can do it, given everything else the fight is asking you to do. So it's not a letdown, nor is it a positive, I would say. But that being said, there is one other thing that's very awkward in Phase 2 that ends up making sense in the grand scheme of the fight. And it's this roughly 30-second window of time that you have to do damage at the end of the phase to essentially beat the Enrage. Now, normally that would be seen as a huge downtime / valley in the difficulty. But because of how strict the DPS checks are in this phase, that time frame and how you use it is so freaking important. If you're ahead of the DPS check, you need to contemplate slowing down or making sure players can properly save up resources or making sure you're saving up resources. If you're falling behind, you need to figure out exactly what you can spend extra that won't mess up your DPS in the future phases. and it will just give you a fighting chance to continue on. You don't want to be too hesitant and then wipe, and you don't want to be too eager and then set yourself behind. It's something you get used to, and it doesn't really become a thought after a while. But the fact that all of that is there because of the strictness of the overall check, despite being a 30-second, just hit the boss moment, is really cool only 5 minutes into the fight approximately. So that actually gets big ups for me that they made that as exhilarating as it is. And then phase 3 comes. Phase 3 is the only phase with a transition into it. It's kind of, there's some other phases that do. They have like a big hit that you need to mitigate, but that's all. There's no like actual mechanics. And this one's not a very difficult transition. 4 people get spreads, 2 people get stacks, 2 people get nothing. And if you did DSR, you know that that's essentially Froth Flames. If not, it's not something that's too difficult to figure out. It's just doing those assignments while dodging AoEs that are either donut AoEs that expand out from the center, or, a triangle of point blank AoEs followed by another one. It's not complicated. It's not too difficult. Just takes a little bit of getting used to the timing and the movement. And then you go on to the actual phase 3. And you have Hello World, which is the most iconic mechanic of O12S, was absolutely going to be in here, but it's combined with the other most iconic mechanic, both at the same time. The 2 most important things that needed to be in this fight from O12S are there, and they are at the same time because Hello World is combined with Patch. Now, what's interesting about this is on paper, that sounds like the worst experience anyone's ever had. And that's despite the fact that there are a lot of awful mechanic combinations that make people uncomfortable. There's things like Light Rampant and, the list goes on and on. But what ends up happening is it's a case of you have so much that it's actually easier, because there's only so many ways you can logically solve the debuffs that they give you once you understand what is consistent about them and what is random about them, that you essentially just come up with 4 assignments depending on what you have at the time, and you just go to those 4 places. The hardest thing being to remember where those 4 places are while DPSing the boss, while mitigating, while healing. It's interesting how they took something that should have been massively complicated, broke it down into really basic elements, but forced a high execution from the players on all fronts. It's just, again, you don't see that often in Ultimates, or at least not done in this interesting of a way. So it just, again, gets a lot of points for me. Not to mention that is like 80% of phase 3. So it's really important that players get comfortable with that exact combination of things. And then to boot, you also learn some really crucial stuff at the end of the phase. In the original O12, there's something called oversampled wave cannon, where it would hit any 2 targets randomly on the side of Omega where he's summoning monitors. But they were tank busters in O12, so you just had to make sure only the tanks were on that side of the room. In this, they're not tank busters, but not only does the boss do 2 of them, he gives 3 players monitors as well, and they each do 2 of them. So at the end, there's 8 lasers that go out, and you need to make sure every player only gets hit by 1. There's a lot of different ways to solve that, some better for others, and some strategies will work better for different groups, etc., etc. But it's a very simple final mechanic check before you just have to beat the Enrage. And it's just it's a good way to use the knowledge from O12S and to also inform you of stuff you're going to need to know for the follow-up phase, because this is not the last time you'll see these monitors, and they are just as frustrating to groups who wipe on them both times that you encounter them. Now, after phase 3, the community calls the next thing phase 4. Realistically, it's just a transition to the phase after, which we now call phase 5, consequentially, because it's really just a 50-second phase that requires some quick movement, quick DPS, and good mitigation and healing. It's spread and stack 3 times while you dodge AoEs, those rings that expanded out during the center during the transition before. But it's so fast-paced. The AoEs and the sound effects are visceral. They sound heavy and bassy and dangerous. And it's honestly my favorite 50 seconds of the entire phase, of the entire fight. I'm sorry. I don't know how they did it, but it's just everything I love about something that's fast and frantic and fun, just condensed into this really short experience. Not to mention, you have to get the boss under 20% before the end of all of this, and all while staying alive, or you wipe. And then there's still a big raid wide at the end, even if you do successfully beat the check. So your mitigation has to be on point for all the mechanics, as well as the enraged sequence itself, even after you beat the DPS check. So It does a lot of things really well. It's just a lot of fun. It's pure, not mechanically difficult, visceral fun. That's how I would describe it. Then you come to phase 5. Now, every ultimate has a phase where most people will say the real fight starts now. And this would be the phase for that. It's what we call the trio phase, where basically every phase up to this point is utilized in some way. All the bosses show up, but they go the extra mile really with this one because there's new mechanics that weren't in the previous phases. Some of them brand new to the ultimate, and some of them still recurring from the Savage encounters in the past. I even want to say one thing that they included back in phase 2 on this same vein that I forgot to mention was the shield and casting mode. That was actually only in normal mode and wasn't used in Savage. And I was really glad to see them bring it back, even if it is one of the slower parts of the fight or one of the less difficult or ultimate worthy portions of the fight itself. But the way they use this phase, it's very much in line with the way you had to solve the previous phases, but it's a lot more free form. You know, in previous phases, you'd be given a logical solution that required high execution. This phase, it is that, but you have so many ways to use the arena and solve everything that you're going to see strategies that are, some are mildly different, some wildly different, but all achieving the exact same thing. It's just about how you think. And given the way that Omega is designed as a character and as an entity, it's just oddly lore accurate and fitting. And that really goes a long way for me in terms of fun. You know, like you'll need to figure out, you know, where tethered players go, what time you're going to break tethers, how far the tethers stand apart, how your partner determines all the same things, just way more random and way more free form. And that is exacerbated by the inclusion of a brand new mechanic in the form of Hello Distant and Hello Near World, the most important mechanic in the entire phase. When these expire, they explode in a large AoE, and then they hop to either the two nearest players or the two furthest players, one at a time. Each jump or hit also gives you a stack of Dynamis. And at the end of the phase, all 8 players need to have 3 stacks of Dynamis, or you can't successfully solve the final phase. The puzzle aspect of it itself isn't too complicated. You pick up pretty quickly once you've seen the entire phase that there are a total of 24 hops. And thus you can do the basic math. 24 divided by 8 is 3. But what ends up happening is, when Trio 1 goes out, you have no idea who's going to get the first Hello Distant and Hello Near World, which means you don't necessarily know who's going to get the other stacks, who's going to take the hops. And then, depending on who does get stuff in Trio 1, that's going to dictate who you want to get hit by mechanics in Trio 2. And then, how you set up Trio 2 determines who has to do certain mechanics in Trio 3, depending on who gets what debuff. So, it's very flexible. Like, we had to come up with a marking system where one healer marked these 3 people, and another healer marked these 2 people, and another person marked the 4 other people. Or I'm sorry, I know that makes 9, but I'm mixing up all the phases here. And then during another phase, you had someone mark 4 people, but then another player would unmark certain players because they were in the middle of a 2-minute window and needed to know their proper assignment. We had to come up with this whole huge complex system to make sure that our Dynamis stacks and who did which mechanics were correct. And it was great. It worked. It was effective. It was a bit of a pain for those people, I am sure, but you know what? We got to just solve it and do it, and it worked, and that's what we had to make. It's just all this logic, all this randomness, but at the same time, all of this common sense. It's just, I don't know how they balanced it all, but they did a great job. Not to mention, again, you got to beat this DPS check, and you got to beat it without a DPS LB3. We DPS LB3'd the transition / phase 4 to get into this phase, but you have to do this phase without an LB3, unless there's an LB3 cheese you can do that gets you an extra one, which at some point there probably will be. And you got to get the boss under 20% again. And then again, you got to survive a big hit. They even rip down the death wall and make it an area where you can be sent just for the cinematics that occur afterwards. It's nerve-wracking when you come out of phase 5 into phase 6 and you're actually in the death wall for a few seconds and you have to move out of it before it decides that it wants to be a death wall again. Speaking of which, after the cutest transition that an Ultimate has ever had, you need to go into Phase 6, the finale, with the new model of Alpha Omega. Now, this one does have a gimmick. Like I mentioned, the Dynamis stacks were going to be really important here. You need to tank LB3 the first mechanic, and then with 3 Dynamis stacks and surviving, you get Quickening Dynamis. This functions similarly to the buff that you got. I think it was called Beyond Limits in Ultima Weapon Ultimate, where if a player has Quickening Dynamis and they LB3, it consumes the buff, or in this case, changes it, and then refills the LB3 so you can do it again. Across the entire phase, you get 10 LB3s, and it is cinematic as hell. Now, you do need to do a bunch of dodging. There's a really tight mitigation check, and of course, a tight damage and healing check, but it's really the LB3 sequence that kicks everything off. You know, most traditional comps will do 2 melee LB3s, then you're forced, while doing a healing and mit check, to do a caster LB3, followed by either a second caster LB3, which would only work if you were running a double caster comp, or a Fizz ranged LB, which seems to be what they intend, a caster LB into a Fizz ranged LB. But you could technically do, if you have a double caster comp, you could do double caster LB here as well. But then after the Fizz ranged LB, it's a tank LB, a healer LB, a tank LB, a healer LB, and finally 1 melee LB, all while surviving, all chipping away at the boss's health, all while you've been dealing damage this entire time, not to mention an auto attack mechanic that just checks to make sure that there's an aggro target and a tank is the furthest away. It's just all sorts of elements. It is a great capstone to this insanely engaging encounter. However, it ends a lot differently than all the other ultimates as well. Now, every ultimate prior to Omega Ultimate doesn't actually kill you all at once. You know, we're used to Savage encounters where you get an Enrage and everyone's alive as you race through the Enrage. In every ultimate prior to this, the party is kind of picked off gradually. You know, in the Unending Coil, you get, what is it? It's not Akmorn, it's Morna Fa. Every player gets Morna Fa'd individually, so you have to, like, spread out and just, you know, you all get picked off by a Morna Fa one at a time. Ultima Weapon gradually jails away your lowest DPS to your highest DPS players. T jails you in a time cell, and then DSR kills you off 3 at a time, really 3-3-2 since there's 8 people, but none of them just outright kill the entire party at once. Here, after a 4-minute, you know, just engaging experience going through all of those limit break checks and all of the different movements you need to do, is a 30-second cast time where the boss is just doing this wild animation the entire time, and you have to kill the boss before the Enrage kills you. And as the screen fills with white, you're desperate, you're at the tail end of your 2-minute window, the boss is melting, but for some reason you're not sure if you'll make it. You make it through. Everyone all at once, no relying on dot ticks, no relying on the last 1 or 2 members alive, no slowing damage, just pure adrenaline and dopamine. And with that, it caps off again at the approximate 19-minute mark. What an encounter they have achieved here. It's honestly exhilarating, even just talking about what this fight does, although I'm sure for others it is more exhausting than anything else. So at the end of it all, what do I think? Well, I think they made the best ultimate encounter that is in the game. And that's kind of surprising to me. I like T, but knowing that this is the same lead developer as T, I didn't expect this to be so refined, so well-tuned, so tuned to the name Ultimate. I mean, the DPS checks are tighter than any Ultimate DPS check prior. The closest thing is alone the Nidstinian check from DSR, but not the entirety of the fight. Just that specific phase was really the tightest check. The healing in Mit is more engaged and involved, sometimes in annoying ways, like in phase 1 with the max HP checks and the tether movements and everything. And at other points, very, very engagingly throughout pretty much everything after phase 1. And the fact that they also don't skimp on the mechanics, they have a mix of uptime stuff, downtime stuff, trio stuff. Every phase has its own identity, its own feel, its own theme. They use all the most important mechanics, all the most iconic mechanics, at least almost all of them. I mean, it's just, it's a marvel. It's also really, really hard. So I expect a lot of people to disband, give up, feel burnt out. And honestly, it raises another point. You know, Ultimate is meant to be the be-all, end-all difficulty, the thing that you strive to overcome, the truest challenge a player can really engage in. And yet everyone is exhausted by DSR and this both being in the same expansion. You know, there's always the talk of, oh, you know, we should get 3 ultimates in an expansion, or, you know, there's not enough ultimates, or maybe one day. I don't know that anyone is feeling like we should get 3 ultimates in an expansion while having the 3 Savage tiers, and on top of that, any sort of other challenge like Criterion Savage, Deep Dungeon solos. Like, there's a lot of hardcore content in this expansion, and everyone I know, and I mean everyone, is burnt beyond all belief in regards to just the mental just anguish and stress and anxiety that has come with all of these repeated next level challenges. And so while Omega, I think, is a masterclass in ultimate development, it really makes me question what is good for the health of the game and the health of the hardcore and even mid-core raid scene. Is this the right decision? Is the double ultimate release per expansion the right step moving forward? Maybe that's another conversation we need to have later. And you know what? It's a conversation you can get started in the comment section of the video below. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. I might do a few more Omega Protocol videos. I actually do kind of want to do guides, but not guides. I really want to do more like information tabloids about the phases and not, hey, you have to do it this way. It's just with Ultimate, strategies always evolve, and it's a way more optimized area of the game, especially by the most hardcore players. So I don't know that I want to do anything that formal, but either way, I'm enjoying talking about it, and I really enjoyed the fight. So with that, I will see all of you in the next video, and until then, take care.